Hello and welcome, everybody. We'll be starting here just a moment. Let people roll in a bit. Want to throw the next slide on so we can just get our pictures up there, Perry?
Sure.
If you're here from last week or this is your first one, either way, feel free on LinkedIn to put in questions. We may or may not address them live, but if we don't address them live, we'll probably come back and talk about them after the fact. So that's something that's ongoing.
All right. Well, let's get started. Brett, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, Brett Schuchert, Industrial Logic, been here for 8 years. I've been doing software in some form or another since last century. My current interests are in Tai Chi and Qigong. So ask me about that if you want at another time.
Or we could repurpose today's talk if you want.
I can apply CI/CD to Qigong. I do. So it's all the same.
Mike, how about you?
Michael Rieser. I've been a developer and an Agile coach for quite some time. Been early into Agile. Love the extreme programming practices and love to see when organizations adopt these engineering practices and really get the results from it.
Very good. And I'm Perry Reid, also a senior consultant working with Industrial Logic, and excited to be with you guys today sharing this topic about continuous compliance. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and dive into the topic. So if you were able to join us last week, we had a similar live event talking about continuous integration, continuous delivery, and continuous deployment. And one of the key thoughts behind that, we shared the slide, and I just wanted to touch on it real briefly, because it really, to me, it speaks to the motivation for implementing CI/CD, and that is this idea that if you are a team and you're working iteratively and incrementally, you're probably working from a prioritized backlog, or you're identifying the most valuable thing to do next, followed by the next most valuable thing, and so on. But that inherently means that for each one of those things your team builds and adds to the product, the value of those things coming after it are necessarily of less value. They are prioritized more lowly. So that means that at the end of the day, if you are holding up a release to squeeze more stuff in, then you're literally holding those higher value items hostage. So this picture kind of illustrates that, and the goal of this idea is that we want to release more often, and the way we do that is through CI/CD. And so Mike, Brett, one of you guys want to talk a little bit about this slide? I think this is...
Sure. Go ahead, Mike. You take it.
Sure. A lot of what we're talking about today is going to be based on continuous integration and continuous delivery. Now, continuous integration is when you actually have developers thinking in terms of always being integrated, not being isolated. And so you're not going to have a lot of branches. You're going to have folks who actually have their software, their code, constantly being shared. And like the definition down here is like all developers have the same code within 24 hours. That's at least. And it's not like they're all on their own branches and they have code. No, it's they have the same code, and they can bring it off of a branch if they need a short-lived branch. Continuous delivery is when you have everything automated with your builds and your deployments. And usually what happens is there's a manual decision to try to push it for a release, to go to production, general availability, whatever you're going to call it. But continuous delivery, everything is automated. Your only thing that's manual is whether you decide to actually go or not. Continuous deployment is even more aggressive. You actually automate even the idea that if you've got everything that's actually been automated up to this point, then it just goes to production or it gets released, and you'd need a manual intervention to stop it. Now, for continuous compliance, we're going to assume that you've got a continuous delivery system set up, and we'll talk about setting that up later. But for continuous compliance, you'll see that what we want is all our requirements, our code commits, our builds and deployments to be linked so that you can actually travel back upstream to find out where a particular thing came from. And this will enable your automated reporting and whatever you might need for regulatory compliance.
So
Well,
let's
wait, before we go forward, I have two comments. Comment
Yeah.
one, on the previous slide on value, you don't have to show the value slide. We talked about hiding value, but one of the values, and this comes from a question from last week, value could actually be something that a user can do to get something out of the system, but also because we're talking about a living, breathing system that evolves over time, validated learning is also that. So you really don't get the value of the learning nor the value to the end user of the system if you don't have it available to those people. And so I just want to throw that in there.
Sure.
Yeah, that's it. And then on this one, if you can grow them together, even better. Just FYI, don't get don't get CD perfectly set up and then add bolt on continuous compliance if you can. It's likely many of you are going to be in that situation. It's fine. It's absolutely possible, but don't do the whole thing. We'll get to continuous compliance later on because we want to do CD first. Do them together if you can, and if you can't, that's fine.
Very good. So let's talk about that. So the question I think worth asking is, how do you get started, and how does continuous compliance fit in with this idea of CI and CD? So I really like the idea that a lot of people have been working in this space. Dave Farley is one that has written extensively about continuous compliance, and one of the things I picked up from him was this idea that we want to achieve regulatory compliance as a natural outcome of how you work. And so one of the beautiful things this diagram is really trying to illustrate is that your CI/CD pipeline, not only is it taking those commits from the team, triggering a build, building the software artifacts, executing all the automated tests, and deploying it to production. In addition to that, it can be instrumented so that it actually supports continuous compliance. And so we've illustrated that here with a couple of additions to your traditional CI/CD pipeline, just to show in the yellow elements on the diagram that we can create compliance artifacts every single time we build our software. So what that means is that if you adopt the philosophy that there is no other way to get a change into production than going through your CI/CD pipeline, then you've got the opportunity to make sure that this instrumentation is collecting and gathering all of that compliance information into a repository that, as we said earlier, can enable reporting out of it. And so I love this slide because it illustrates how much you can leverage the technologies available to us in CI/CD, and by augmenting it just slightly, you can begin to use this as a way to support continuous compliance. So along those lines, Mike, is there any thoughts you have about, how do you grow this? How does this transform, into continuous compliance from a starting point with CI/CD?
Yeah, I think one of the things that folks need to realize is they often use, we're in a regulated industry, as a reason to not do certain things. And in reality, the continuous integration, continuous deployment ideas can be added in a regulated environment. You can actually separate those things which need very special care from those that don't. You can also build very small and slowly, and you don't have to have everything as a big bang. You can work on this in steps. I've often asked folks to just make a checklist of what their normal release process is, and then as we go through them, we always try to automate at least one of those steps. Now, this is assuming somewhat frequent release, so you'll actually get there sooner. But there's no reason to try to think you have to do this all big bang. You can build it out in pieces. Part of what you need is the linkages that go back upstream to your other systems. You're at some point going to be able to trace. So an investigation might start at the end and find out what the build is, and from the build try to figure out the changes that were made, and from those changes what was the requirement or the defect artifact that was being asked for that change. A lot of folks, even in a regulatory environment, don't think that you can work iteratively, incrementally. And I think that's also a mistake. Yes, you can. Some of the very first NASA projects were all iterative and incremental. So, it's very possible to do this. You don't have to, wait and put it off. You can do it.
Yeah. Welcome back, Brett.
Sorry, killed the window apparently.
No worries. So starting, it would appear that for success with continuous compliance, would you say that it depends on CI/CD? Do you think is there any other way to be successful with continuous compliance?
I think having the automation, it actually allows all of the artifacts, the information, the evidence, if you will, to collect itself while you actually go through the process. And one of the things you can do is eliminate a lot of manual forms and a lot of other things that you would normally have to do. In addition to the work, you have to do this other stuff. And really what you want to do is you want to marry the two so that while you're doing the work, you're also in compliance. And you don't want to allow for anything to be done in a non-compliant way. And the automation can actually help you with that. It's like, oh, this is the way we deploy, whether it's a hot patch or a normal release or whatever else.
So I find a lot of similarities between this idea of continuous compliance and things that we're already doing from an Agile perspective. The idea that with a software team that's working in an Agile way, building value incrementally over and over again, the advice that we often give them is that you want to leave the code base in an always shippable state. So that as you add additional features and change things, that it is in fact shippable at any time, and it becomes a business decision as to when you actually ship. With a software team working in a regulated environment, what's interesting is that we need to be able to be accountable to an audit at any time. We don't necessarily get to pick and choose the timing of when an audit occurs. And I can speak to my own personal experience on this. I was the director of engineering for a biotech startup many years ago, and we got a knock at the door one day, literally got visited by the Food and Drug Administration, and they were there to audit us. And what was interesting, up until that point, we believed that we were the type of medical device that didn't fall under some of the FDA regulatory compliance requirements. But the advice we got on that was not worth the money that we paid for it, because we ended up being subject to audits. And I spent, the next several days learning painfully that we were nowhere near compliant with what the FDA expected. And that spun up literally 6 months worth of effort on my part, bringing our software processes, our practices, and the evidence that we collected into compliance with the FDA. And what I realized at that point, which was totally new to me, was that the FDA is doing that as a way to protect the public interest. They're there to make sure that devices that go out that serve the public are safe and reliable and will do no harm. And so embracing that idea was essential for us to be successful with our compliance. So moving forward in time, I've held on to that experience, and recently all three of us had a chance to work in another biotech related with a biotech related client, and that resonated so much with me as we went through that, because you need to be always ready to answer the questions: are we compliant with our requirements and other stated evidentiary things that the auditor might ask for? So this idea fits in, I think, so incredibly well with the idea of continuous integration, continuous delivery and deployment. we also need to be able to support continuous compliance. So
just have an observation about this and something sort of a reframe. You know, one of the things we talked about was CI. CI is a set of agreements upon how we as developers are going to work together. And it really requires a mental shift, right? You have to think about responsibility, what you're responsible for. Where does your responsibility begin and end? Like the definition of done, all that kind of stuff. It's the same thing here. And Perry, you said it. If my system is always shippable and my system is regulated, then part of shippable is by definition, it's auditable. And so as a developer, if I do anything that is anti-compliance, then I need to stop doing that. So notice I need to actually think about my activities a lot further along. And also my definition of done is now I can prove it.
So we got a question from Tim Oninger. Says this seems like a classic case of if you do this when it's easy, you won't have to do it when it's hard.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. I mean, and it's like a lot of things, you know, the best time to plant a tree was 30 years ago. The next best time is right now. Right. And this definitely dovetails into the notion of evolutionary design, right? You can't solve the problem, but you can pick up that piece of trash and put it in the trash can, and that's better. And so your mental model should be, is this better? Is it doing less work? Is it less resistant to how the system is working? But I might need to change both my requirements or how I think about my requirements, my interaction with my customers, and my feedback mechanisms to try to balance that all out. But it mostly starts with, you got to change your thinking about what is your responsibility as a contributor in an ensemble in terms of what you all think is done. And if you can't get that, then none of the rest of this matters.
So another thought from my experience going through an FDA audit, I was really fascinated by the fact that she was less interested, the auditor was less interested in the details of my process than she was that I had a process defined, a reasonable process defined, and that I had evidence that I was following it. So if we said we did X, whatever X is, she wanted to see some evidence that we did X. So this idea on the slide of achieving regulatory compliance as a natural outcome of how you work, and this tying back to what you were just saying, Brett, I think you do have to have a mental shift in the way you think about your work, so that it, as Tim says, you do the easy thing now instead of having to do all this hard work later. And I want to take that into the next slide, because what I found, one of the most significant things that the auditor that I interacted with, she wanted to know, what are your requirements? Show me that you have a handle on what it is your medical device is supposed to do. And we had requirements written down, not terribly well organized, but we did have some written down, and there were some gaps. And so she looked at that. But over the years, as I've become exposed to things like this book on specification by example, it really lends itself to this idea that I need to reimagine or rethink how we do requirements. And that's the beautiful thing that this pivots into. So, Mike, I know you've got a lot of experience with specification by example. Maybe you can talk us through a little bit of what that means.
Yeah, I think one of the things people fail to realize is one of the ways you can unambiguously express like a requirement, something that the system needs to be able to do, is to do it in the form of a test. And so we've always used tests at the end of the system, at the end of the process, to try to validate or critique, if you will, the system. What if we actually use those tests to help us to specify it? And it's not a requirement for continuous compliance, but I'm going to say that adopting this can actually hugely impact in a good way how you can actually create software which is extremely robust, high quality. People have actually thought through a lot of the other things that could go wrong prior to it getting to the point where someone's now testing it. So it's really nice because you've actually got it at the front rather than at the end. So you can specify your requirements through tests. There's a lot of different tools for it. I think we have an example of something with Gherkin and Cucumber, but not a requirement that you use that tool for specifically. You can still do continuous compliance with whatever your requirements repository is.
Right. So let's take a look at that. So this is an example using Gherkin of specification by example, and the details are really unimportant. This is an example we put together just to illustrate the point. But the things that we circled there are important. So Gherkin is a structured form of English. So it reads like a requirement specification would. So it definitely helps increase the communication paths with your client base, and making everybody involved with this aware of what it is you're trying to build and what it means. But the beautiful thing about this, these call outs is that using things like tags, you can link this feature file, this text-based feature file, which is version controlled in your software right alongside the code that implements it. You can create these tags that could link to other systems if you had them. So if you had a separate system that where you had maybe your list of system features described and maybe a high-level requirements specification document, you don't have to abandon that. You could link to it from here. And the same thing in the middle circle, the idea that individual scenarios or individual behaviors can be referenced separately makes that even more powerful. And then the last circle is the idea that we can describe this behavior as a concrete set of examples. So it moves the requirement space very nicely from a very sort of ambiguous English phrase to a very concrete set of examples. Mike, again, this example is one using Gherkin. You mentioned that it doesn't have to be Gherkin. What were some of the other technologies you used to implement something similar?
Oh, well, there's the older fit and fitness types of tools. There's like Concordian. There's a variety of these types of tools out there. But it doesn't matter what tool you use. One of the things I think, though, that's an interesting side effect of doing things this way, though, is that this is an actual test. You can actually hook this up as an automated test, run it, and that table down at the bottom will sort of like brighten up and glow for when everything is passing. Or you'll get a response like it's in red if something is failing. You can also get the textual representation of that in case you need the actual like audit trail of when did this test pass. The linkages, the tags, like the @ signs there, they're intended to be able to hook up to whatever other external systems you might have. So you can continue to have your traceability. I think the other thing that's extremely interesting when you start to work in this particular manner is that the test that is passing and the code that's making that test pass will often be in the same commit. And so they move atomically through the system as opposed to, oh, we wrote it at this point and then sometime later it passed the test. You'll actually see instead that they're concurrent. It's very powerful.
Yeah, I think moving from abstract requirement specifications to concrete is, it's a shift in the way you think about writing requirements. But I really think it has some incredibly powerful benefits. Things like the increased clarity and detail. Brian Merrick is famous for having said, an example would be handy right now.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes time to understanding what does this requirement really mean, and show me an example of it. And using tools like this, you can create examples. In this case, of the happy path, where it works the way you expect it to. But what happens if the system encounters an unexpected value? What happens if there's a negative value for hours worked or something like that? What would you expect the system to do? So it definitely increases the clarity, and I think it leads to a higher quality of the system. But most importantly, as you pointed out, Mike, it's really a powerful way to get you into the space of automated testing. And it's in that automation that makes continuous compliance possible. And as you said, in using a tool like Cucumber that runs these Gherkin feature files, it produces artifacts that are so clearly visible about what of these specifications pass. And the nice thing about the Cucumber framework is that it can be modified and extended to make it customizable. So this gets back to one of the points we made earlier about success around continuous compliance. I really think is connected to this idea of viewing your auditor and the audit process as a collaboration and not a confrontation. And one of the things that I think leads to success is that if you can begin to look at the auditor as a consumer of these artifacts, these automated reports, then you can begin to ask them, what do you need to be more efficient, more effective in your auditing of us, and make sure that your continuous compliance reporting artifacts give them what they need.
I think it's important also to recognize that when you're doing this automation, you're changing some of how you were collecting the data. You're not going to have, for instance, the computer trying to fill out a PDF form and submit it, or some other sort of manual documentation. What you're doing is you're changing it such that the process you're actually following is annotated or decorated, that it actually collects the right data at the right time about what you were doing. And there are common places where you have to input something anyway. Like, for instance, if the developer is writing a commit, well, he'll have to actually just add into it the linkage back to what is this requirement for. And so, the idea is you don't create additional places where you have to add information. You actually just make it a part of the actual way that you prefer to work, and you end up being also compliant at the same time.
One of the benefits that comes from the specification by example is this idea that a team can begin to incorporate their domain knowledge and their understanding into this document as a form of additional documentation. It basically enhances the understanding of the team and aligns it more tightly with the customer. And I think incrementally as you do that, it inherently takes on more value and keeps everybody in sync. That's something I learned from Stephen Baker, working with him, and some of the work that he did with RSpec. But it's a powerful way to work, and I think it's worth mentioning that this can help lead not only to the benefits I mentioned earlier about increased clarity, increased quality, but automation that leads to continuous compliance.
So any closing thoughts, y'all? We're pretty much out of time, and I'd like to give everyone an opportunity to say a final thought before we wrap up. So any closing thoughts, y'all? I have a couple. One thing is beautiful. Evolve using small steps, right? Your mantra should be better, not perfection, right? You're not going to solve the problem. You don't eat the elephant in one sitting, or you don't eat the life-size, the huge artichoke in one sitting. You pace yourself, right? So we really want to take small steps, and we really want to slowly over time improve. So always go for better. I'll strive for that. Strive for better now instead of great never. That's my closing thought.
I guess one of my thoughts is, don't use humans to do repetitive tasks. Let computers do repetitive tasks, and let humans do the thought work. And I think you'll do much better that way. It's a way to improve the environment of where you're working when you're not having to constantly do a lot of this. It's there for a reason, but on the other hand, you just feel like, man, I wish I didn't have to do this all of the time. And especially when the computer could do it for me. So I think, have computers do repetitive things, not people. Let them do better, higher value things.
Yeah. And I think the important thing to me is that we move ourselves to a position where we are always ready for an audit. The timing of those things are not in our control often, And so working in a way that makes our system not only always shippable from a customer point of view, but always compliant is the goal. And everything that CI/CD does for us leverages that in a beautiful way. So they are wonderfully coupled, and it makes it a much better way to work. I think it's a way to go, beautiful way to go. All right.
Looks like we're out of time.
Looks like we're out of time. Well, thanks everybody for attending. And Mike, Brett, as always, appreciate your thoughts.
One thing, I think this is our last talk for the year. We'll pick these back up early next year. Same thing. And honestly, if there's a subject that you would be interested in, you can ping one of us in either at our emails at Industrial Logic or certainly on LinkedIn, and we'd be happy to talk about them. So
absolutely. All right. Well, that's right, guys.
Y'all. Bye.
See ya.